I'm Alexis Coe, and I'll be reading from my new book, my only book, Alice and Freda Forever, A Murder in Memphis, for Evan Karp's The Right Stuff at SF Weekly. And since this is for readers in the Bay Area, I should mention that the book will be carried at City Lights, Kepler's, The Booksmith, where I'll be in conversation with Mallory Ortberg on October 22nd, Book Inc., Book Passage, Folio, Green Apple Books, and many other fine independent bookstores. In 1892, America was obsessed with a teenage murderess, but it wasn't her crime that shocked the nation. It was her motivation. 19-year-old Alice Mitchell loved her same-sex fiancé, 17-year-old Frederica Ward. The two planned on marrying, but of course in 1892 Memphis, same-sex marriage was illegal. The term lesbian wouldn't even emerge for another 40 years. And I should mention, over 120 years later, same-sex marriage is still illegal in Tennessee. In order to accomplish this, Alice was going to dress as a man. She was going to fashion her hair short and don a suit, which she had ordered, and go by the name Alvin. Interestingly, she promised, if it would please Freda, to grow a mustache, but she never really elaborated on how she would do so. The very night they had planned on lighting out for St. Louis, their love letters were discovered, and they were forbidden from ever speaking again. Freda moved on quite quickly, which left a heartbroken Alice even more desperate. With each unanswered letter, she grew more and more depressed, and by January, she had pilfered her father's razor. On a cold winter's day, in broad daylight, on train tracks, Alice slashed Freda's throat, and that night she was arrested, but she would not be tried for murder. She would be tried for insanity, and the reason was she told her father and her lawyers and the jailer and the judge the truth, which is that she loved Freda and wanted to marry her. The idea of a childless marriage, a marriage that had no hope of producing progeny, and that passion could exist between two women, let alone that women could feel passion at all, was so foreign to the nation in 1892 that they thought it was nothing short of insane. And they used other words, which are pretty familiar to those who follow same-sex marriage today. Unnatural, strange, perverse. They called it an impossible idea. And Alice was judged by a jury whose, quote, chivalry exceeds their sense of justice. And as you can imagine, these fine men of Memphis, all white, all middle to upper class, agreed that Alice was indeed insane, and there was no medical expert in the entire state of Tennessee who was willing to refute that. Alice was remanded to an asylum where she died under mysterious circumstances just a few years later. And I will read from one of the many threatening scenes that led up to the murder in 1891, so a year before. Freda was far more capricious with her affections, as Alice would soon realize, but in 1891, their greatest challenge was geographical. Freda's eldest sister, Mrs. Ada Volkmore, had moved to Gold Dust, a small town on the Mississippi River, and their father, the widower Thomas Ward, soon followed. He relied on Ada to look after Freda and Jo, Freda's elder sister. But the new city offered him more than just help with his youngest daughters. Back in Memphis, Thomas had been a machinist at a fertilizer company, but in Gold Dust, he was able to work as a merchant and a planter. Things were looking up for the Ward family. Alice and Freda had no choice but to make the best of it. They no longer lived in the same city, but when they visited each other, they did so for weeks at a time. Every day was spent together, every moment precious. And the nights were advantageous too. After they kissed their families goodnight, it was expected that they would share a bed, their bodies close, their movements obscured under the covers. Long visits spent in such proximity had a downside too. It became harder for Frida to hide her infidelities from Alice, and even harder still to escape her anger over them. Late one night in December, the Mitchell home was still. The entire family, with the exception of Alice, was fast asleep. She lay in bed alongside Frida, wide awake. In her hand, she clutched a bottle marked poison. Before falling asleep, Frida had admitted to loving not one, but two men. The sun would rise soon enough, ushering in the day that Frida would return to Gold Dust, where she would once again move freely, far from Alice's watchful gaze. As the hours passed, Alice concluded that either she or Frida would have to die. Laudanum, a potent mix of opium and alcohol, was easy to procure for various aches and pains, but it came with a warning. The solution was highly concentrated, and fatal doses were not uncommon. If Alice could get enough past Frida's lips while her beloved slept, the drink would likely be her last. Alice would eventually write out a more comprehensive list, how to kill, but that night laudanum was her only option, and she could hardly guarantee that there was enough for both of them. And so she lay there, inches from her love, contemplating how many doses she held in her hand. And that was the scene that greeted Frida when her eyes fluttered open. She was sharing a bed with a young woman who was deciding whether or not to kill her. The night was fraught, and Alice openly brandished the bottle, while Frida was too scared to close her eyes. And yet, Frida stayed in that bed with Alice. She never called for help, and she never told the Mitchells or her own family what had happened. Daybreak did nothing to quell the drama. Laudanum in hand, Alice followed Frida on board the steamer that would soon leave for Gold Dust, cornered her in the stateroom, and locked the door behind them. "Marry whomever you want," she said, and downed the bottle herself. The trial challenged gender norms, and for the first time in Memphis, women were allowed to watch a trial, seated separately. And it was bizarre because the courtroom became the most democratic space in all of Memphis. And so I'm going to read just a little part of the way newspapers reported this. So people from across class, race, and gender lines shared a space. They sat side by side as they would in almost no other setting in Memphis. This is a bulk quote from a newspaper. "Staid matrons and their young daughters sat cheek by jowl with women of doubtful character and women whose lack of all character was blazoned on their faces as plain as a pikestaff. There were white and black, mulattoes, quadroons, octoroons, and a sprinkling of the genus whose class has never been defined, all eager to see two of their sex in the peril of their lives, and hoping, perhaps, to hear something excitingly naughty. Female spectators, who Dubose, the judge, and founding member of the KKK, all-around terrible person, separated from the male spectators, featured prominently in print. The press, who were almost all white and male, never failed to describe the women's craning necks, distracting bonnet plumes, and artificial flowers, all with a palpable degree of disdain. The best place for ladies to watch during the trial is about 4 feet from the hearthstone," the Avalanche Appeal complained. You're no doubt wondering, how does one convince not only a jury, but the nation that same-sex love equaled insanity? And this is very much like throwing things against the wall to just see what stuck. And that was the brilliance of the insanity plea. It gave an explanation to something people found inexplicable. Foucault said that people seek to silence unreason by defining reason. And it's a really handy way to regulate classes of people that society deems deviant. However, the reasons they listed were ridiculous and often conflicted each other. And so I'm going to read some of my favorites. There is a lack of symmetry in the facial contortion. So I would also be considered insane because we all have a certain lack of symmetry in our faces. She is left-handed. At puberty, she displayed symptoms of excitability, because nobody does that at puberty. She intended to commit suicide, but forgot. Her face is larger on one side than the other. She is very childish. These two are my favorite. She is weak-minded. She dominated the mind of Freda Ward. How can someone who is weak-minded dominate another person who was not deemed weak-minded, but rather a healthy, normal 17-year-old girl? One of the many excellent questions you should raise while reading this book. Thank you.